So we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, I am Cynthia Gertzen. I am the Associate Director for Arts Education with Ford's Theater, and on behalf of Ford's, welcome to the fourth week of our Lincoln's Great Words Challenge. We hope that this workshop will be a valuable resource to you as you learn more about this incredible speech and any of Lincoln's speeches, and we hope that this workshop and any of the workshops inspire you to make a video for the challenge. And please encourage everyone you know to make a video and send and share with Ford's as part of the Lincoln's Great Words Challenge. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. This workshop is being recorded. You're welcome to turn off your camera if that makes you feel most comfortable. You can put your comments and questions into the chat box during the workshop. We will monitor it throughout the workshop. And then at the end, we'll have a pretty short question and answer time during which we can answer those questions and during which we will invite you all to turn on your cameras and join us in a conversation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our workshop leaders for today. Miss Ashley Buster is our teaching artist. She grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring, Maryland. She earned a BA in Broadcasting, Telecommunications and Mass Media and Theater from Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a Master's of Arts in Educational Leadership and Supervision from Loyola University in Maryland. She's appeared on a variety of local stages in this area, including Ford's Theater in The Wiz and Freedom Song. She is currently the school programs manager at Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C., and she is an associate artist with Ford's Theater. She is also a most treasured and valuable teaching artist in Ford's education programs, and she works in our local oratory festival as well as our National Oratory Fellows program. Miss Caitlin Goodwin teaches 7th and 8th grade American history at McGraw Junior Senior High School in Central New York. She is a Master Fellow in our National Oratory Fellows program, having joined us in 2016. She loves the energy and enthusiasm of young adolescents and is passionate about helping them make connections between the past and present day. She considers herself a lifelong learner and spends much of her free time engaging in professional development opportunities, so you know you're in good hands. And she is also an incredible asset to all of the work that we do in Ford's education. So without further ado, Ashley and Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And special hi to all my Ford's Theater oratory friends. I am so excited to be a part of this today. Teaching about the Gettysburg Address is one of my favorite things to do during the school year because I really love thinking about kind of the social history and the context of not just the speech itself, well, when Lincoln gave the speech, but also of the town of Gettysburg and the people that were involved and just kind of everything about it. There are some really, really interesting aspects of this speech. So I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share. Am I good? Yes? Yes, okay. Okay, so for anyone who's with us that has not a lot of knowledge about the Gettysburg Address and the circumstances that surrounded Lincoln giving this speech, it was in November 19th of 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg had taken place on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of that same year. In the town of Gettysburg, they had initially buried the massive amount of the dead on different spots of the battlefield. If you've ever been there before, it's quite expansive, but there were a lot of issues with that. It was kind of hastily dug graves, and there were some, without getting too graphic, there was a need to move the soldiers to somewhere a more permanent resting place. I've put up a slide that has a picture of Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, right in the kind of middle of town. And David Wills, who was a judge in Gettysburg at the time, had sent a letter to Abraham Lincoln asking him to come and give a few words of consecration to at the dedication of the cemetery. So I think one of the really fascinating things about the Gettysburg Address is that a lot of people have this image of it in our heads and in American culture of this kind of scene with Lincoln delivering, as this picture shows, kind of this just very proud, very, you know, grand oration. And I think that's something that a lot of Americans really kind of treasure. The reality of it is pretty different from what this particular image portrays. And it's interesting when I teach my students about it, because we like to kind of think about, well, how do we have this image in our heads of what how Lincoln looked giving the Gettysburg Address, or what was going on at the time. So I like to look at a lot of the eyewitness accounts from the Gettysburg Address with my students. And of course, we look at them for their validity. We assess them, whether, you know, we use Sam Weinberg's historical thinking methods of sourcing and contextualizing and corroborating our sources and seeing what matches up and thinking about what else was going on at the time. And so some of these, in this journey to kind of learn more about the circumstances surrounding the speech, there are some phenomenal eyewitness accounts out there that you can look at. So one of them being John Hay, who was one of Lincoln's personal secretaries. He wrote about kind of the scene in the town on the night before. You have to imagine Gettysburg being a town of, you know, I actually don't even know the number. I remember hearing it was somewhere in the hundreds before the battle, that, you know, after this major battle took place, the town definitely got bigger, but it's still not really as, not a huge place. And so to have Lincoln come and to have Everett, who was also one of a very well-known speaker at the time, come to this town, the town, by all accounts, was really kind of a very fun place to be on the night before and the day of the Gettysburg Address and the cemetery dedication. So apparently it was a bit raucous. There were lots of drinking, dancing, kind of fun activities. And as John Hay says, as you can see on the slide here, we went out after a while following the music to hear the serenades. The president appeared at the door and said a half a dozen words, meaning nothing, and went in. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, who was staying around the corner at Harper's, was called out and spoke so indistinctly that I did not hear a word of what he was saying. Another eyewitness account that I found really fascinating was from an NPR project that was called Lost and Found Sound. And they were collecting audio recordings that were, you know, people may have found these in, you know, a grandparent's attic or something along those lines. And there is an account, and you know, we have to evaluate this for credibility, and it's actually very interesting. And I've included the link here so that when this posts online, that people can go ahead and take a listen and maybe do a little bit of historical investigating themselves about, you know, what we can and cannot find reliable about a source that, you know, of a 9-year-old boy who witnessed Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address and then recounting his thoughts in 1938. So, and it's a bit showy, but nonetheless, my students really love to listen to it. And when we corroborate it with other sources, it is really interesting. And one of the things that my students always take away from this is that he says, and there are other sources that corroborate with this as well, that at the head of the procession, preceded by a mount of military band, the first I had ever seen, rode the president. He was mounted on a gray horse of medium size, which accentuated his unusual height, his long legs reaching too near the ground for either grace or good horsemanship. That's one of my favorite kind of tidbits, and other sources as well point to Lincoln riding in this procession on a horse that was really too small for him. And my students have drawn some really funny pictures to kind of show this. It's one thing they take away. This is an account of what happened that day from a reporter. I thought his name was on here, but Young was his name, and he described the scene at the address and how it went. So I'll just take a moment and read it in case people are not looking and just more listening. Mr. Lincoln arose, walked to the edge of the platform, took out his glasses and put them on. He bowed to the assemblage in his homely manner and took out of his pocket a page of foolscap. In front of Mr. Lincoln was a photographer with his camera endeavoring to take a picture of the scene. We all supposed that Mr. Lincoln would make rather a long speech, a half hour at least. He took the single sheet of foolscap, held it to almost his nose, and in a high tenor voice, without the least attempt for effect, delivered the most extraordinary address which belongs to the classics of literature. The photographer was bustling about, preparing to take the president's picture while he was speaking, but Mr. Lincoln finished before the photographer was ready. I remember it was a beautiful October day and there were 4,000 to 5,000 people present. Very few heard what Mr. Lincoln said, and it is a curious thing that his words should have made no particular impression at the time. The noticeable thing was the anxiety of all on the platform that the photographer should be able to get his picture. I remember we were all very much disappointed at his failure and were more interested in his adventure than in the address. Now, he wrote this in 1890. So there are a few things we can take away from this that maybe, 25, 30 years later, that it's still not that much in American memory. But he also, and this is pointed out, that he says October and it was November. So, makes us kind of question things a little bit. So this on the right is a scene that a photographer did get a shot of. And then this slide, as we can all see, is in case anyone doesn't know, this is the one actual known photograph that exists of Lincoln delivering the address. And you can kind of see him here. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley for a few.
Yes, here I am. All right, great stuff. So I wanted to start out by sharing this quote by Edward Everett, who also spoke at the same occasion. I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. That's real. This was a very short speech. It wasn't very long. It was about 10 sentences, like 270 words, nothing super crazy. But the word choice and the structure and the things that were put into this speech were a huge part of why it was so moving and why it's still such a great example of powerful speech writing today, because it's a rhetorical playground. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So of course, yes, the context of which the speech was given, we've gone through all that and everything. So when you look at the people who Lincoln was speaking to, there was a lot of emotions, a lot of things that he had to cover and that he had to make up for. And I think the cool thing about this speech is that it kind of tells a story. It sort of starts talking about what the country was founded upon and then ends with where the country is now. And even though it's ending in 2 different places in that sense, it also starts and ends in the same way. I think within the first 2 sentences and within that last sentence, he kind of goes full triangle in terms of the rhetorical triangle, hitting ethos, pathos, and logos really hard with the things that he's saying and the choices that he made on how to address these people, what he started with, how he grabbed them, and how he left them. So I'll just go through and I say we read the speech first, and then I've made some notes on some really interesting things throughout the speech. The 2 things that he uses really heavy in this speech in terms of rhetorical devices are different forms of repetition in terms of words, structure, sounds and a lot of contrast and antithesis. Those are two things that we see over and over and over and over and over and over again in very different ways throughout the speech, bunched up together, that make it really interesting. So, fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Dun, 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 the Gettysburg Address, y'all. Super powerful, super crazy. One of the things that I think is really important to notice when looking at this speech is the idea of repetition. Let's start with words. The words we and the word here are the most used words in this speech, and they're repeated over and over and over again. And the reason those words are so important when I look at it is because it's showing togetherness in the situation. It's showing unity, and it's kind of giving accountability to everyone, not just to one group of people or the other. And when I look at the word here, there's an immediacy to the word here, a presence about the now and what we're currently dealing with in the word here. So if you were to even take this speech out of context and look at it in terms of general ideas, you could apply it to so many different times in different countries and different situations and make it very immediate and very present and hold loads of people accountable and make people feel that they are being called to do something and that they can all have an answer or solve the problem for whatever's going on. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the speech, just kind of break it down. If we start with 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I take a look at how he could have just said 87 years ago, but that's not fun. So of course you want to go ahead and you want to start off with some fancy wordplay and make it really nice. You want to also take a look at some alliteration here, which is one of our forms of repetition. For, fathers, forth. And for and forth is also another form of repetition. It's the same word in different forms. That's polyptoton. We're not going to get into all the fancy like Greek names for a lot of these forms, but you can take a look at a lot of the words and the phrasing, how he repeats things over and over again. Brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. You see allusion here to other documents in this country's history and what this country is founded upon that are talking about why we're all here, what we were meant to be doing, and what this country stands for. You also see a little bit of rhyming right at the beginning. Fourscore. It's fun stuff. Moving on. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So we see our first we popping up here as well, one of many we's that we see going on here. And we also see a repetition of the word conceived coming back again. You see the word dedicated repeated again. and you see the word nation repeated again, one right after the other. By repeating these words and these phrases over and over again, it's a reinforcing. I notice this when I have to teach this speech to students, that they get in a place where it's like, he keeps saying the same thing over and over again. And I ask, why would somebody repeat something just for it to mean the same thing every single time? There's a lot of trying, I think, to make people think when you repeat something, it means something different the second time you say it. And then it means something further the third time you say it. There's a reason that it continues to get repeated over and over again. And I think with those words specifically, he does a really strong thing with that. And then you also see repetition of phrasing with this as well. Or any nation so conceived and so dedicated. There's a lot of tricolons in this. So you have 3 things repeated over again in the structure. This first time we see it, it's just 2 phrases repeated over and over again. And
Actually,
this is also yeah, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, and contextually, I find this part of the speech really fascinating because, you know, Lincoln will bring these same points up in it throughout different, you know, speeches that he gives, talking about, you know, whether or not we can endure half slave and half free, as he did in his House Divided, or, you know, we also have to think about the fact that it was January 1st when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So yeah, this is heavy on the minds of the nation. And, you know, well, he brings that back again in the last part of the speech, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and I look at a lot of those as like a challenge or a call to action for people, whether it be mentally or those who are actually physically able to go and fight and do something about it. And that's also something that's really impactful with a speech. You want to leave people inspired to do something or asking themselves, is there something I should be doing? And I think that this speech does just that. All throughout it, you see him calling people out, asking questions, challenging things, challenging the situation and the system, if you will, if you were to make that something that was more relevant to today. So we move on to the next bit. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Repetition again of the words, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. There, not only do we see the repetition, but we see one of our first big examples of contrast, antithesis, saying that this is what we've come here to do, but we can't actually do that because of this, that, and the third. So that's another powerful thing that's happening a couple times in and throughout this speech, not just with phrases and ideas like that, but using words that are contrasting and in opposition, one right after the other, to make a point and to serve a point. The next chunk, the brave men, living and dead, again, who have struggled here, there goes the word here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. More rhetorical devices that are working really nicely there. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. There's a whole lot packed into that. Those same devices are at play over and over again. And I think it's interesting because the world remembers. Here we are, we're talking about this. So the irony in that, you see the balance between the words little and long. It's the small, the large. We say here, they did here. So it's the opposition between us and them as well, talking about the we and the present all in the same chunk. Here we are. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated. He says the same thing, but kind of rearranges the words there. And it's one of those bits of repetition. What the first one is an example of something that we call anastrophe, where he kind of just jumbles the words up, doesn't say it the way that we would say it normally. And that's done, I think, to drive the point. And then he repeats it again, like, let me make it plain for you, in a sense, is how I take it. That's how I look at those things. Rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. We have repetition of the word devotion. We need to take increased devotion because they gave the last full measure of devotion. It's the opposition again. Here's what they did, so here's what we need to do. So playing the opposition and then repeating the same act. It's another challenge. It's another call to action, using the same set of words that he's been using all along. And moving along with that same phrase, you see the repetition of all that good stuff there. So that we hear, he puts the two words together. And I think that's really interesting because that's the first time we see the two words that are used over and over and over right next to each other. And it's coming to the end. Dun, dun, dun. We hear. Highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain. Repetition. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Now, with that whole chunk, we see the opposition again, that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation shall have a new birth. And then we move down, shall not perish from the earth. And that's right after we have a whole series of repetition of the people, by the people, for the people. And when I look at this bottom chunk and I look at the top chunk, we see again the alluding to other documents and writings in our American history and in the words that we're commonly using over and over again. He's put that out again. And then we also have references to what the country is meant to stand for. The government of the people, by the people, for the people. And then there goes the challenge again. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation will long endure, back down to shall not perish from the earth. So he ends it with the same challenges and allusions that he started it with. And there's actually a lot of really kind of confusing and intricate uses of opposition and repetition in the speech that if you continue to do a close read of it, you can pull out. So when I say it's a rhetorical playground, every time you read this speech, you find something new. It almost means something different. Oh, well, perhaps when he said it, he put the emphasis on this part. Oh, well, he might have put emphasis on that part. It's a really interesting speech to teach because depending on who says it and how they interpret it, it can land in different ways and mean different things to different people. So yeah.
I love in this, when I read it, his use, when we talk about contrast of death and birth, kind of, you know, like final pieces. And then, but we have this moment to be kind of born again. It's almost like this, you know, there are biblical references in it, and it's just his words are, and I love that, you know, he had kind of in the end when he talks about, you know, of the people, by the people, and for the people, emphasizing that that's who this is about, because he had faced so much criticism that he was, you know, kind of overstepping his bounds as the president, and, you know, kind of challenging the Constitution, you know, with habeas corpus. So I think I love his word choices here. I think that's why we all, whether or not we even have taken the time to really dig into it, I think it's still just, you know, everybody loves the language in this particular speech.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my favorite bit is shall have a new birth of freedom, in contrast to shall not perish from the earth.
Yes.
Yeah, I think just those two lines say so much. It kind of sums up a lot of what we're talking about.
Like maybe this
birth of freedom
is going to be like a rise up like the phoenix from the ashes of the war.
Absolutely. And almost that we need that new birth of freedom in order to not perish from the earth. Timeliness, relevance, which is also what makes it very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is kind of our next, a very good segue there, Ashley, into our, you know, what are our takeaways from the Gettysburg Address, and, you know, talking about how Lincoln creates this speech where we have a past, a present, and a future. And, you know, he's, at the end, kind of that call to action and thinking about here's what happened here. How are we going to make sure that we progress forward from here on out? And I can't remember his name. Henry, the one who Henry Bacon, who designed the Lincoln Memorial. And some of us may not have much, knowledge of the Lincoln Memorial, but it's really fascinating because when you take a look at Lincoln, and you can see it in the picture that I've seen here, when you go and visit this monument, and of course it's breathtaking and overwhelming. And I remember going for the first time and having someone point out to me that Lincoln's posture, that it is specifically designed that Lincoln is looking out onto the Capitol, onto the country, really, our Capitol symbolizing the whole country, and that he's not sitting statically, right? That he is almost, his positioning, his foot, his hand, one hand kind of gripping, it's as though he's about to get up. And the interpretation is that he's about to stand up and kind of keep going, keep working toward the things that he wanted, to kind of, hold true to that, all men are created equal. And it's really, we're discussing this, talking about how fascinating it is to continue that today, that this is still, Lincoln with his, commit with the Emancipation Proclamation and his commitment to ending slavery, that, it's powerful to think about how Lincoln would be today, still about to stand up and keep moving forward as a nation, that's what we should all be doing. Ashley, did you want to mention about the word choice?
Yeah, I was just actually looking at the speech right now, and I don't know if it was intentional, but I keep thinking, say, even with like the protests and everything that's been going on now, or whatever the case is, if you were to look at some of these streets as a battlefield, in a sense, this same exact speech could be delivered like today. And I think in creating a speech that is so like timeless and so applicable to so many different situations, his word choice of using the we and the here was really, really important. I lean heavy on that. We is unifying and it holds everyone accountable. It's easy to talk about the they or the them or the you or the I, but when you include yourself, it allows people to feel like you are for them. And I think that's why the word we was such an important choice. And here and now, even which is in here, like I said, it's really present. And I think that's also what made such a short speech so powerful, but so direct, because you almost feel like this guy's talking to me. What's he saying to me? You listen when you feel like someone is talking to you, not just kind of talking over you or talking to those around you or talking about themselves and you happen to be there for it, but I'm being spoken to. And that constant challenge and call to action, if you will, that's kind of weaved in and throughout everything. Is this the question and answer portion? Is that what comes up next?
I think so. I'm gonna stop the screen share.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley and Caitlin. That was really good, really informative, and also just like idea generating. The chat has been really busy here with people's thoughts as we have gone through the speech and thought about just everything that is entailed in there. We would love to invite you all to turn on your cameras, unmute yourselves. If you have thoughts or questions that you would like to share about the speech, now would be an excellent time to do so. as this is our question and answer portion. I'm so excited because so many people turned on their cameras. Hello, everyone. Um, I'll just start with something that I found very interesting, just looking at the word dedication and really hearing, for me, what stood out this time was just kind of two meanings of dedication, both committing to something, like myself committing to something, and then also being given to something, and going into just the idea of like under God. To me, it just sounded so much like an anointing. Because like in the Bible, when a priest was chosen or when a king was chosen, they would be anointed before they were sent out to accomplish this thing. And it's almost like Lincoln being the head priest and kind of like anointing the people who were here, who were there, to go out and to not just like let others fight for the work, but to also join in the fight themselves.
Excuse me? What did people that were there during the speech think of it when they heard it? Because it was only 2 minutes compared to the previous speech, which was 2 hours.
That's a great question. So there are some kind of like today, whenever anybody has something that they, a public figure gives a speech, and different people have different thoughts about it, and a lot of times it's because of how they feel about that person, right? We kind of call that bias. So sometimes today you hear the president speak about something, and the same exact word will one speech, someone will report on it one way and some will report on it another way. So there are some different newspapers who had some really interesting criticisms, that some of them thought that this was the best speech and they called it a gem. A couple of different people said it was the perfect gem, deep in feeling, compact in thought and expression, tasteful and elegant were some of the nice words they used. Or the remarks by Lincoln will live among the annals of man. Some of these really just so complimentary. And then some newspapers said things like, oh, this was my favorite one that I found. The cheeks of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dish-watery utterances. Doesn't sound like that newspaper thought very highly of Lincoln. There are some different accounts from people who were there. I think a lot of the people who were there, though, the tricky part was a lot of them didn't hear it. There were people who said they were really disappointed with how short it was, but a lot of them barely heard what he said. Remember, this is 1863. There are no microphones, and if there are thousands of people around, it's definitely tricky to hear what Lincoln probably had to say. Great question.
Caitlin, just real quick, we have another comment. Can you speak a little bit about how Lincoln felt about the Gettysburg Address? Do you know?
I actually don't know. That is really fascinating. Maybe
Mike,
I feel like
do you?
I feel like Mike might know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, from things that I've read, I got the sense that Lincoln was not impressed with the speech because of the poor reaction from the crowd to it. Remarking to somebody that he was sitting next to that I think the words were that speech won't scowl. And so I don't think Lincoln got the sense that he was very happy with it at all, which, when you take it in contrast to Edward Everett's comment back to him, I'd be happy to know that I accomplished as much as you did in 2.5 hours as you did in that 2 minutes.
Well, we hear a lot about Lincoln's kind of humility and in his speech, that he was very, brief and in a lot of the things that when he spoke, and especially when he spoke kind of off the cuff, that he really just gave these very quick things, and that he wasn't necessarily very impressed with himself ever.
You are your worst critic.
Well, and given the fact too that, when he was invited, make a couple of appropriate remarks, like he was an afterthought to the occasion.
I was thinking as I was listening to you guys talk about, or I guess I just made the connection between, I know that many of Lincoln's speeches, he draws on the Declaration of Independence as sort of his, this is the thing that's the most important thing to guide what he's doing. But I also was struck how because we just did the first inaugural workshop last week, and how he reminds the listeners or his audience, he's making the connection to the patriots who fought and how we should all be connected to the sacrifice that they made for this country, and how he is making that same connection in this speech about the soldiers that, he's always reminding people. I mean, and it could just be because he's president during a civil war and this is the thing he's always having to talk about. But I just think it's a really smart choice to constantly remind your listeners, if you want them to do something, if you want them to continue making a sacrifice or to continue supporting your cause, you have to remind them of everybody who came before you who made that sacrifice and fought for that cause. I just think I hadn't made that connection before till just now. And I think it's very interesting.
Cynthia, it's a really good point you make. And that's the thing about his message. When you look at the first inaugural to the Gettysburg Address to the second inaugural, he's really building on the same message. It's just refining that point, and he's the master of rhetoric. I mean, he's really, really good.
I also think it's been very interesting in the order of the speeches that we've been going over, that you've been offering us, that you also see that, certainly from the Independence Hall speech to this. And it just kind of, I think, gives you some insight into the way he thinks and what's important to him.
Yeah. I was wondering if anybody wanted to talk a little bit about the beginning, middle, end structure of the speech, because I also think that that's something in this speech in particular that I think is fascinating, that it's a short speech. It's basically 3 paragraphs long. The first one's the beginning. The second is the middle. So the beginning is where we were when the country was founded. The middle is where we are now, and the ending is where we are going. So it's sort of like inspirational, aspirational. And I just think that's so smart that he was able to construct that in such a short, in 3 I couldn't do that if I was given 45 minutes. And so it's remarkable. But I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on sort of the structure of that and how he, it also goes from birth to birth, right? The country is birthed, and then we're going to have a new birth of freedom, and in the in-between time is where sort of the death and reality happens.
I mean, I think it's interesting to consider Lincoln standing there and just, how much he internalized a lot. What we know about Lincoln, that he was internal about his feelings of guilt over the war, and that when I hear this address, I think about how, what he must have felt like being that person, the second person, but still as the president, thinking about, to what degree is he responsible for these 50-some thousand casualties that happened on this battlefield, and how the nation is reeling, and, maybe just thinking that all he can do is really to make that call to action, is to say, like, if this is this all for nothing?
Dave just put something really interesting in the chat, and I went back and I was just looking at it. And if you look at the way Cynthia was talking about the beginning, middle, and the end, with where we started, where we are now, where we need to go, Dave said dedication, past, present, future. When you look at the use of the word dedication throughout this speech, there is mention of what the country was dedicated to do, like what it was founded upon, and what we are doing here right now in terms of dedicating this land, and what we need to be dedicated to do moving forward. So that's actually really cool, Dave. I didn't look at it that way. And maybe he did it on purpose. You know, like, it's a very interesting use of, because the word dedication or dedicated is also scattered throughout. So that's very cool.
Cynthia, I don't think I had really put together this juxtaposition of talking about birth in this place of death before until you mentioned that. And that's really kind of a fascinating choice. It was just a year ago that when I was doing this with students and I asked if there were people who didn't know a word, if there was something we needed to look up, and the student said she didn't know what conceived meant. And that was really the first time that I was like, oh, conceived, birth.
Yeah.
Duh.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you know, the other thing, it just came and went in my head. Gosh darn it. Oh, because he personifies the country. He makes the country kind of a female. If the country's conceived, well, I don't know. The country didn't do the conceiving. The country was conceived, so the country's the baby in that imagery. But he personifies that. He makes the country sort of a human, and he does that also in. Doesn't he do it in House Divided? He sort of makes, he makes the country like a home, like a place that you live that's nurturing, right? Or something like that. So I just think that he uses imagery and he understands that, that emotional appeal very well when he wants to make people take it into their hearts and into their minds. So if the country is like a human being that's living and breathing, then we need to keep fighting to protect. Or if the country is a house that we need to make sure we keep in order and we do our best to not fight so that it crumbles, that's something that many people, not every person, but many people can connect with that and understand that. And so that's the pathos, right? That's the connecting to emotion, connecting to imagination, and feeling like you've got something in it too that you have to, it's part of you too.
It's all very biblical, speaking in parables.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Using things to represent other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in his language too, it's like, I'm not super familiar with biblical language, but I feel like when I hear words like perish and conceive, like it's just, they're meaty words. They're not just like born or die or end. So they're words that you can kind of hold on to, and they carry weight and emotion and values with them.
Sarah just posted something that I wanted to mention in the chat too, that's really important for us to think about, is that, you know, to what degree is he thinking about the re-election? I don't know if it's because of my fondness for Lincoln. To me, I don't think it's a political, like a re-election speech or campaign. But what I truly want to believe is that he wasn't putting the message in there that we have to continue this, meaning I have to stay the president, but that he was really saying we have to continue this because it's what's right. But it is, you know, he's coming up on re-election, and if he's not the president still, who knows what could have, you know, how things might have been different with the end of the war or with everything else. So it's definitely a really good, important point.
Caitlin, that was more what I was trying to get at, is that, this is Sarah, I'm not I'll turn my camera on, but I'm outside. But if you think of the election as being his acknowledgement, I don't know if George McClellan was the only person, if he already knew that George McClellan was the person he'd be running against when that happened, but McClellan was going to stop the war and divide the country. And part of the reason, I mean, he didn't want to just be reelected to be reelected. He wanted to be reelected because he felt that he was the one who was going to keep the war going. So I don't know what the timing is, but I think that's interesting.
I think that does also go back to him reminding that, like, being committed here at this battlefield is also being committed to our union. It's also being committed to seeing the war through. All of those things, I think he is very aware of them, even if we don't bring them like to our initial readings of the speech. They're on his mind, you know, and especially just thinking, you know, I don't know, because I have not, I'll say, like, I have not done all of the research to know exactly how he felt about the deaths, but I think he was very affected by the number of people that died. And I know that he thought a lot about whether or not this was the right course of action. And you know, from his like meditations on the divine will, which it was not for everyone or anyone, it was for himself, that like he also just struggled with, you know, what was the purpose behind doing this and if it was really going to be the right direction for the country. And I think it was because so many lives, he had to see so many people die. And I put that like that because there are so many people who died in slavery every day. So
Absolutely. I'd just like to say, you know, in listening to it being read today again, thank you, Ashley. It kind of felt to me like he wasn't just speaking to the people there at Gettysburg or even to a larger audience of all the people in our country, but sounds to me, this time I heard it like he was talking to himself a little bit. You know what? This has not been easy from the day one, and as you all said, I think he deeply felt each death and amputation that occurred in that war. And he was not only asking his fellow citizens, the sons and daughters of our fathers, to continue this unfinished work. Those are my two favorite phrases: unfinished work and new birth of freedom. And it just, when hearing it, it sounded like he was to himself as well. And I also feel it was not only to that generation of Americans, but it's something for all of us to think about. The unfinished work. Think about the new birth of freedom. We still have unfinished work. It's just, it's a piece of genius and probably the best political speech that ever has or will be written. I'll leave it at that.
How does this resonate with modern events, and is there a modern speech like it? The Gettysburg Address, I mean, I'm talking about that speech.
Is there a speech like it? I want to say I don't know / no.
I think Sarah, I bet you Sarah has an answer. Miss Jenks.
I actually, earlier, I said in the chat, I wish there were a speech like it. I think we need one today.
Mm-hmm.
We need that kind of rededication, and we need to feel that there's someone helping us to see the way forward. And I wish we had a Gettysburg Address for today.
Yeah, I certainly don't think there are any contemporary speakers that I am aware of who are able to get to the point and make such an emotional connection while getting to the point in such a logical way in such a short amount of time. I don't think there's anyone who can do it 2 minutes on.
Within those first two two sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying, it goes full triangle. Like it took the beginning to the end and been done.
Dave McIntyre saying Ronald Reagan's Challenger speech. I don't know how long that speech is. And he definitely didn't write that speech, the Challenger speech, right? That was his speechwriter, I want to say.
He had some great speechwriters.
Yeah. I don't know how long is the Challenger speech. Does anyone know that?
The Challenger speech, Milo, in case you or anyone else doesn't remember, is the speech that President Ronald Reagan gave after the Challenger, the space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded in 1986. And was it 12 people were killed? I can't remember exactly how many, but they were scientists, and they included a teacher who was supposed to be the first teacher in space. And it was a terrible moment for the country. And Ronald Reagan gave a really profound speech about how we would rise again to put people in space. It was a real moment of, especially after so many years of success in space, it was a real moment of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Peggy Noonan wrote that speech.
Yeah, a couple of things from the chat. Peggy Noonan wrote it.
448.
And also just to note that so many people don't write their own speeches now.
That's true. I do think also the venue for, so it's interesting to think about location of speeches, and so Lincoln is speaking at this field. So it's very public, and it's a very long time ago. Ronald Reagan's Challenger speech was a speech that he gave. It's a one-shot camera. He's sitting behind a desk in the Oval Office, and it's a close-up of him speaking to the audience, which he doesn't see. He's not seeing the audience. He's seeing the camera. Now, Reagan was an actor, and so he's was very, very masterful at connecting with audience and delivering his lines. But it's interesting to think about the comparison between those two speeches. I wonder in what way does audience affect the orator, like and how their speech is delivered and received.
Audience and what you just said about Reagan being an actor. Those are two really important things to consider.
So maybe not quite, but last week we did a workshop with the Reagan Presidential Library with some college students. And one of the speeches that our teaching artist used to highlight inspirational speaking was George W. Bush's 9/11 speech that he did at Ground Zero, which apparently was not, from what I understand, according to the flash of resources that flew in the chat box there, was not written out beforehand. Now, I don't know, maybe Dave McIntyre will know this, or maybe Sarah will know this, but it's a speech that where he interacted with somebody from the crowd who said something to him, and then he said, "I hear you, we hear you." So I think that was, it's maybe not quite the Gettysburg Address, but for George W. Bush, I think it was probably a really high point in his or speaking as a president. It's worth looking at.
Awesome. We also have over here just about Obama's speech in Charleston and him singing Amazing Grace. So if anyone wants to look those up, I think it might be an interesting sort of extension activity to do, just to see, if they do resonate or have, we of course we won't know about really timeliness until much later, but hey. Thank you so much for joining today. It is, we're at 5 o'clock. We want to respect everyone's time. We appreciate you coming. Thank you, Ashley and Caitlin. Excellent job. This was such a wonderful examination of the speech, of the time, of the impact, all of those things. And thank you all, our participants, those who it's your first time joining today, or if you have been with us for the last 3 sessions. We appreciate you and are really glad to have you with us, as well as your comments, your questions, your interaction. It was really great. So please be sure to join us next week. We will be doing the Lincoln speech. It was an address to the 166th Ohio Regiment, and that is also not a super long one, but it is very interesting. And I do so appreciate just looking at the journey from Lincoln's time when he was a representative with the House Divided speech up through with this group of speeches we're doing to the second inaugural, and it's really a fascinating journey. So we hope that you will continue to join us as we go forward, and also be sure to submit a speech to our Lincoln's Great Words Challenge. We look forward to getting more videos. We've gotten some rolling in, but would really love to have more. So get yours in. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great evening.